Doc Ryan, Expedition 44, here again with Matt. We're continuing our series on Job. We've been doing a Bible study at our church, and every day after the Bible study, we make a video talking about what we went over. So last night was another great class, and one of the things that we got into was the actual figure of Satan. And so usually when you're reading the book of Job, you just kind of assume that this is the cosmic evil figure throughout Scripture, particularly the New Testament. But I would challenge you that if you actually sat down and had never heard the story before and read it particularly in Hebrew, that really wouldn't be your takeaway. And so there's some interesting things that when we look through this we're going to point out. But before I get there, oftentimes we hear preachers speak metaphorically, and we really don't think too much of it. In fact, last week one of our pastors spoke at our church, and he was kind of talking about the idea of Satan accusing a believer of being guilty of different things and God defending the heart. And I asked him afterwards, do you actually believe that Satan goes into the presence of God and kind of has this argument with him? And he said, no, I don't believe that at all. It's just a spiritual metaphor. And so you hear of these people kind of describing these spiritual metaphors, but when it gets to something like the book of Job, for some reason when we describe the storyline of Job, people are kind of hesitant to go with that metaphor situation, because I think naturally we want to look at the Bible literally all the time.
Yeah, we have this in the Western evangelical thought of everything is face value, because that's the way our news comes to us, and that's what our textbooks are in school.
Yeah, and when you read the Scripture, it's not like that really at all. There's all kinds of places that are a metaphor and allegory, and I mean the best example of that, the parables. I mean, you just don't read the parables and think that. So when you look at the story of Job, it's a little harder to put that together, because you're trying to go through and see what's literal, what's figurative, where it all lands. And I don't know any scholars that say, oh, it's completely literal. You can't really read the book and say that. And so then you're trying to say, well, where does that line cross? So when you look at this kind of chapters 1, 2, and I would put 42 there with it, that's kind of the story of old that could be a very ancient story of a real person named Job that lived and suffered all of these things. But when it's describing this kind of divine council scene, it appears to almost be more of a play form, I might say.
Yep.
And so we look at it that way, and when we look at it that way, we kind of put it in the same place where we say the Bible isn't trying to be a science textbook. It's not trying to teach science. And in the same way, this story is not really so concerned with telling exactly how things would be, but it's kind of setting the stage of saying, here's an extreme situation in reality that happened with a very righteous man named Job. Now, if it were in the heavenlies, let's just kind of talk about this. And people get confused because they want to talk about it from the character of God perspective and learn as much as they can about the character of God in chapters 1 or 2, but it's kind of a little bit deeper than that. So the other videos are seeking to answer those questions, but today we want to hone in on the figure of the Satan himself. Matt, what have we learned up until this point on that figure?
So what we see in Job chapter 1, he basically comes into God's council meeting. It seems to me he's referred to as the Son of God, part of God's divine council, and we made a video on the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which talks about that in Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32 and other places in the Bible that point to this. And most Old Testament scholars, even New Testament scholars, see the validity that this is an actual view and something that we have to deal with.
And even if you don't necessarily take that view, you don't believe it hook, line, and sinker, I think actually we take a pretty literal view there with it. But even if you don't, you should recognize that that's the way that their culture was thinking. Mm-hmm. And so Matt and I would date this being composed in a final origin as we have it around the Second Temple period, which was a little Hellenistic and had that kind of thing. And so when you read it with that flavor into it, there's no doubt that they were thinking that way.
Yeah. So what else we see the Satan doing is he's kind of the policy watchdog for God. He's looking out for God's policies. Are they good policies? And then he kind of brings a little ambiguity to Job. He's like, hey, your retribution policy of blessing people that are righteous is kind of creating this circular thing, is they're only being righteous because they're getting stuff. And Job, if you take away his stuff, he will curse you.
Yes. And so what comes out here is that let's just put the name aside for a second. And if you put the name aside, which we're going to get to in a minute, and you read this chapter 1 story, does this challenger, we'll call him, come off as seeming evil to you?
To me, no. I think he's actually asking a good question.
Yeah.
So it seems like, hey, if you have this principle, God, it's kind of, people are going to be able to work your system.
Yeah, and the idea, as Matt said, is that up until this point, when you look at the Old Testament, it looks like those who were righteous were blessed. And not only blessed from a sense of spiritual things, but also very much blessed by a sense of physical or material possessions too. And there's a lot of theologians that believe that this is being questioned in the book of Job and actually might change that policy after the book of Job. And we've mentioned this before, but the health and wealth thing of late, those aren't good words. You don't see people happy about that. So it seems like that policy might have been adjusted from the workings of possibly a dynamic God that is adjusting things along the way. We don't want to get too much into that right now. We might open up that story a little bit later with another video. But the point is, the policy that the challenger figure is bringing up is actually a really good kind of recommendation or something that he points out to the figure of God here.
Yeah, so we see the question is not inherently evil. It's pretty neutral, actually.
And some people have brought out the idea, well, out of this comes killing of people. Would that be something that God would allow? And again, that's why, in some way, when you say this is more of a literary device, you don't even go down that road.
Yeah.
But if you do go down that road, you look at the Old Testament, and we can't necessarily understand when God chose to take lives. We see it several times, especially outside of his people in the conquering of the Canaan. And so that's a tough question, and we're not really going to address that right now. But if you're thinking of that and saying, well, this figure seems evil because of that, I would be careful with going down that road.
Yeah.
What else do we know about him?
All right, so let's look at the term Hasatan. So in the Bible, in Job chapter 1, he's referred to as, if you translate it in English, the Satan.
Yeah.
So, which probably, with the indirect object in front of the word, it isn't a personal name, it's a title.
Yeah.
It's more of a job description. His job is to challenge,
yes,
like we said, policy watchdog.
Yep.
To bring up these things to basically help God keep order.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way that I see that the role of this, and maybe this person turns into be the cosmic evil guy, maybe not.
So I think that's important that we say it could go either way.
It could.
I mean, we just don't know from what we have here. And the timing gets interesting here, because if you're going to look at this and say, is this the cosmic evil person? The first question that you have is, if it's Satan, has he fallen yet? Mm-hmm. And so if you're going to view this as, yes, he's fallen and he's coming back into the divine council, and you're going down this road to have this conversation, this gets very problematic.
It does.
Like, would God have the central cosmic evil person come up to his council and give him any kind of ear at all? Almost, you put it before, giving him the keys to the kingdom almost, and saying, sure, go for it. And so that does not fit with the picture of the character of God and the rest of the scripture. Yeah. And so that's where Matt and I kind of go slow down. I'm not sure if that works. And so if you put it before the fall, some people would go back to the fall and they would put Adam and Eve as not necessarily the first people that were created, but the first priests that were created. And so if you look at it this way, the story actually could kind of come together and make a little more sense, but it's still problematic. But that would put somebody outside of Eden that's going to be perhaps close to a city or something like that, and maybe making their own sacrifices, as we see throughout the book of Job. But the problem with that idea is there's too many references in this book that put the story way later than that.
Yeah, Ryan and I kind of both, we take it as kind of the patriarchal era, somewhere around Abraham's time.
Yep.
It seems to make the most sense there based on if you look at covenants in the Bible and where they land.
Yep. So going back to that reference, there's another reference of rain in the Bible, and so, that's
after the flood.
Post-Noah. Sacrifices, some people would even say, well, that's a much later dated thing. So when you see the sacrifices in Job, could that have happened, during the time of Eden? Well, maybe. We just don't really know how that formed. But if you're putting this central figure as somebody that hasn't fallen, and we're witnessing the narrative when he offers the apple to Eve, it could make sense that way, but it's still very problematic to look at it that way.
Okay, so we talked about the term Hasatan. So this, in the Old Testament, can apply to both a spiritual being and humans.
Yeah.
So we have to, I guess, parse this out a little bit to see, is this guy in the spiritual being in Job chapter 1 the cosmic bad guy?
Yep. And there's several scriptures like Zechariah and 1 Chronicles where we kind of see this coming out a little bit, but there's also something to be said about the definite article in the Hebrew. Mm-hmm. What's your take on that?
So it really just means when the or a is before the word Satan, it it doesn't refer to a person, but rather a title or an action that they're doing.
Yeah.
So they're opposing, they're challenging, they're being an adversary. We see this in 1 Kings 11. Hadad the Edomite is basically coming against, God's using him to come against Solomon.
Yeah.
You see it in Numbers 22. We've talked about Balaam.
The
angel of the Lord is a Satan.
So how do you reference, if you're going to put this name as the cosmic evil person, how do you come to grips with the angel of the Lord being referred that way?
You kind of have an allusion to that in 1 Kings 22, where they put the divine council puts lying words in the prophet's mouth, so Ahab goes and dies. They're acting as a Satan right there. 2 Samuel chapter 24, and the parallel there in 1 Chronicles 21, which we kind of talked about a little bit. You have David taking a census, and in one account it says it's a Satan, and the other account it's God's anger.
Yeah.
So God isn't Satan.
Right. So if you look at it this way, one of the hermeneutical challenges that we have is we want to address things in Scripture the same way. We don't want to take one and say we're going to do this. So typically when we get to a tough word in Scripture, and I will say that Job is one of the most ancient forms of Hebrew we have. It's a very difficult book to understand. There's places where we get to it and we have these words that aren't found anywhere else in Scripture. And so what do we do with those words? Now luckily in this case, we have a whole bunch of examples in Scripture. And so this is actually, when we're working through it, theologically, it's pretty easy. Like, we don't wrestle with this one. There's no like major challenge or place where we're going, oh man, I don't know what to do with this. It's an easy study. And so you take the places outside of this book where it's used the same way, and then you come back to this Scripture and you say, what makes the most sense? And in this one, it's the word Satan, even though in the New Testament we've gotten this terrible connotation of the cosmic evil person for that, you have to understand that in this older Hebrew sense, that's not necessarily what it means. It's more of a generic word for a challenger at this point. And it does also take on a few other connotations, like the word accuser at times and things like that. But if you were just sitting down and reading this, like I started out saying, and reading the language, you wouldn't at all put this as that cosmic evil person. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that it's not that cosmic evil person. How could that kind of work its way through in the second temple period to get there?
So we talked about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. So if you hadn't heard of this, we have a video on it. So Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, Moses is recounting the Tower of Babel. When God divides up the nations, he puts a son of God, an Elohim, over each one to kind of rule them, and he selects Israel as his own. So all of these other nations, the sons of God over there, they fall and they lead these nations astray. So in the second temple, they see that, all right, so if this is their worldview, there's got to be kind of a king of these fallen Elohim, sons of God. So they have different names for it. Satan kind of becomes the one that sticks by the New Testament, where it even though in the New Testament it has the indefinite articles quite a bit behind it, sometimes it doesn't and refers to it as a name, but I'd say almost all the time it has the same kind of viewpoint as the Old Testament. But they do depict that there is a head guy. Right.
So it's kind of this idea of this major spiritual warfare. That you have all of these divine beings that kind of fell and rebelled, and in that time period, we kind of tend to stick Adam with the sin of all mankind, but in that time period, if you could go back and like do an interview with somebody that was theologically minded, they would actually kind of pin it on the fallen gods
quite a bit,
quite a bit, almost more so than they would put it on Adam at that point. So you look at it that way, and it kind of denotes possibly from that point on this reference to negative fallen spiritual entities. And then in the New Testament, we see it take on the figure of the central evil person more. But as Matt pointed out, not all the time. It still is used as more of a generic challenger usage at key points throughout the New Testament.
Yeah, and sometimes they take that head guy to refer to the whole of all of the fallen beings.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. So when we put this together, you have to ask the question, does it make more sense to look at this as some kind of a Satan figure in terms of the cosmic evil person, or does it make more sense to view him as just a challenger?
I think that theologically, for me, this is my opinion, is it makes more sense to not see this as the cosmic evil guy, but more of a role on God's heavenly staff team.
And I view it that way too, because I just don't see God giving Satan the time of day if you look at him as the cosmic evil person. He doesn't in the rest of the Scripture. Why would he?
And the keys to the car.
And the keys to the car. So that's the reason why we take that view. However, there's a couple good reasons to go with the other view, but I feel like if you're going to do that, you really have to put them pre-fall, and all of a sudden, like we kind of alluded to, that gets very problematic. So that is the figure of Satan in the book of Job. You can continue to follow with us. The next thing we're going to look at is the characters of the story. May God bless you.